Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Hidden Messages. This will be Part 22, Chapter 22, entitled Explanations. Izuku never managed to go on that date with Katsuki that weekend. He woke up on Saturday in the hospital with stress fractures in both arms and legs due to work exhaustion. He pushed himself to the limit holding that building up, and now he was paying for it. The combination of healing quirks at the hospital was able to lessen the healing time from a few months to a few days, but they kept him until Sunday morning for observation, and he had strict orders to refrain from walking until Monday at the earliest, and to refrain from any extensive physical activity for a week. It wasn't great news, but no one died from the whole ordeal, so Izuku counted it as a win. Aizawa, Shinzo, Todoroki, All Might, and Katsuki had all made appearances at the hospital on Saturday. Todoroki didn't stay long. He came by to make sure that he was all right after he watched Izuku pass out, but the others spent most of the afternoon in his hospital room. From then, he learned more details about what had happened. Aizawa and Shinzo had little trouble capturing the villains after they left Izuku. As soon as that was handled, they had called for backup. Unfortunately, the majority of the heroes that would have been helpful in that situation were either out of town or didn't respond in time. All the heroes in the city had been contacted, including Endeavor, with no other heroes responding that could actually help hold up the building. Endeavor woke up his work-study students. They were the first heroes on the scene, aside from Aizawa, Shinzo, and him. Todoroki was sent in to use his ice to take the weight from Izuku, while Endeavor and Katsuki were supposed to assist with the evacuation. Katsuki had fought to get to Izuku. That was what the yelling and explosions that Izuku faintly heard were from, but he was convinced instead to help get the civilians out so that Izuku could let go sooner. By the time that Todoroki was able to brace the building enough for Izuku to let go, the majority of the civilians were actually out. Few people were injured in the chaos, but by some miracle no one was killed. Unofficially, there's also an investigation looking into the company that built it, but that's being kept quiet for the time being to avoid the villains looking like they did something good. All things considered, it was a successful rescue. Aizawa didn't even tell him off for breaking bones, and neither did Recovery Girl when she visited. They both told him that he needed to work up to his limit, but they both understood that the only other option for him was to let hundreds of people die. All Might said that he was proud of him, both for holding the building up and for what he had done during the exercise the week before. Sunday morning he was released back to the dorm. He was the last person to get back from his work study and the only one that had spent any time in the hospital. It was strange being back in the dorms. Many of his classmates seemed to be glad to see him as well, but they were also still uncomfortable around him after that assignment the week prior. Leaving the hospital, he had planned to spend the afternoon on the couch in the common room, but the strange mood changed his mind. Instead, he spent the afternoon in his own room. Katsuki didn't leave his side, and all the members of the Baku squad had stopped by. Shinzo stopped by, too, right before he left to go on his date with Kaminari. Izuku tried to tease him a bit, but it wasn't very effective when he was cuddled in Katsuki's arms. It wasn't a bad day, but it wasn't the date that he was expecting, so he was a bit disappointed. By the time Monday came around, he was pretty excited to be able to get up. He'd never been the type of person to sit around, so not being able to walk for a day had been difficult. He was also looking forward to their heroics class this afternoon. He wanted to find out what score he got on the assignment. Their morning classes were unremarkable. Lunch was a little interesting, but only because Shinzo and Izuku were still not really welcome in their friend group, so they sat with Katsuki, Kaminari, Kirishima, Mina, and Sero. The group he normally would sit with wasn't quiet, but this friend group is on a whole nother level. They were yelling and laughing the whole time. It was amusing to be around, to say the least. Finally, it was time to get their scores, and Izuku was on the edge of his seat. He had heard from Katsuki, as well as the rest of the allies, that he had took it further than any of them did, and his classmates all seemed to agree, but he still wasn't sure how much further than everyone else he took it. Last Friday that we were all here, you all took part in the last part of the secretive communication assignments. You're expected to continue to use the skills that you learned from these assignments in the future, but you'll no longer be given assignments related to them. That being said, I will hand out your grades at the end of class. Class today will be spent going over the basics of creating a secret language. Tomorrow, you'll all be tasked with working together to create a secret language or a code to be able to communicate with each other if you ever find yourselves in a situation where you can't speak out loud. Aizawa looked at Shinzo and then Izuku. I've never assigned this to a class before. It had never been relevant. However, this class is not like any other class that I've taught. You've been in more villain attacks than any other first-year class, and I'm not naive enough to think that you won't be in any more. During this past week, there had been more than one situation where a secret language would have helped, and I will not let that happen again. Aizawa explained before he started his lecture about creating secret languages and codes. Izuku was only half listening the whole time. He had plenty of experience with languages and creating his own, so he really didn't need to pay attention. He thought about starting a conversation with Katsuki, but he didn't really feel like talking either. Instead, he just doodled in his notebook and was waiting for grades to be handed out. Finally, with only a few minutes left until the end of the day, Aizawa started talking about the assignment. Before I hand these scores back, I want to talk about a few things. First, before anything else, I want to say good job. Most of you did well, with 9 of you getting over 100%. Second, I want to talk about scoring. All of us teachers watched the video footage carefully, monitoring who helped who as well as who lied to who. If we felt like the allies you wrote did not actually match what happened in the exercise, we adjusted your ally list accordingly. For example, if you said that Midoriya helped you, and you weren't one of his secret allies, he didn't, and his name is removed from your list. Izuku could feel many eyes on him as Aizawa talked. He almost wished that Aizawa didn't say that, but he knew that they would find out anyway. That is, if they didn't already know. I also want to mention that the removal scoring was modified a bit to account for 2 people not being removed. The scoring rubric was an oversight on our part. We knew it could happen, but we failed to prepare for it accordingly. Before I talk too much about your grades, I also want to talk about the 2 secret ways to get points for this assignment. Just like the entrance exam, there was the option for hero points. These could be earned by helping someone complete their task, saving someone, or giving someone else an object. The majority of you at least got a few hero points. The second type was less common to earn, but they were worth the same amount. We called them espionage points. These were points that were earned by betraying someone, lying, stealing someone else's object. As I mentioned, only a few people had earned this type of point, but those who did all ended up with some of the highest scores. There were whispers throughout the class about these 2 different point types, but Izuku wasn't listening. The more Aizawa talked, the more he realized just how plus ultra he'd gone. He could think of numerous moments in which he probably earned extra points just off the top of his head, and there were probably more. Now, I do want to say a few things about your scores as a whole. Usually the highest scores are just the ones that utilize secret communication, but this time that was only partially true. The 2 highest scores did use a form of secretive communication, but many of the others that were using a code were actively being worked against, so their scores were not in the best. Izuku could feel the glares directed toward him, but he kept his eyes focused on Aizawa. He didn't want to see the hatred on his friends' faces. There was one student who had something to prove, and that was completely skewing the scores. Normally, the majority of the scores are mid-range, so there's a much smaller spread, but this year the range of scores is massive. One student more than doubled the previous record score. Izuku could feel more eyes on him, and he fought the urge to cower in his seat. It became more apparent that he needs to at least explain his reasoning to his friends, even if they weren't likely to forgive him for it. I only have a few notes that I should mention. There were only 6 total points removed for going against the spirit of the exam, which is the least amount ever. You all did well in following the rules. The only thing that I am slightly disappointed about is how few of you had actually found each other's clues. Very few of you tried to be sneaky. Instead, you all relied on just trading information. That's not a bad tactic, but you all could have figured out more if you were trying to observe others. With that said, good job. Aizawa finally finished talking and started handing out the papers. When he got to Izuku, he tried to fold the paper to hide the score, but everyone already knew that he was the highest scorer. Izuku kept the paper folded on the desk long after Aizawa had moved on. He'd been excited to see his score all day, but now that he was faced with it, he couldn't bring himself to look at it. He knew that his score was the highest. There was no way that it could be anyone else's, but that meant that he had more than doubled the previous highest score. He felt guilty about it. He had meant to go all out, but he didn't mean to completely dominate as he did. Finally, he took a deep breath, unfolded the paper, and promptly choked on air. The score of 339 was written in a bright red pen at the top of his paper. Katsuki had been trying to get his attention for a while, but Izuku didn't acknowledge him until after he had stopped talking. The fuck, nerd? Score did you get to have that kind of a reaction? Kachan, I got a 339. Izuku felt faint as he had answered. Holy shit! Katsuki yelled out, not caring that class was technically still in session. Before Aizawa could reprimand him, the bell had rang signaling the end of class. Izuku started to get up, but a voice from across the room stopped him in his tracks. Why? Deku, why would you do this? Why did you work with Bakugo after everything that he said and did to you in middle school? Why did you kiss him? Uraraka was standing by her seat as she asked. Many people had started to leave the room, but after hearing the question, they all stopped and turned to look at Izuku, waiting for his answer. Izuku sighed and looked around at his classmates. It's a long story. Immediately many of the classmates had started to argue, but Izuku kept talking. I'm not against telling you, but it's going to take a while. Why don't we head back to the dorms and I'll explain everything? Izuku felt Katsuki reach over and grab his hand. He held on tight as their classmates had voiced their consent to his proposal and started to leave the room. If Katsuki wasn't holding his hand, he wasn't sure if he would have made it to their dorms. Along the way, Kendo went up to Yayorozu, asking if she had any idea why their scores had come out the way they had. Apparently Class B had not done well. Yayorozu had informed her that they were about to find out, and somehow that turned into Class B being invited to his impromptu explanation. During the walk to the dorms, he and Katsuki had a short conversation. They decided that Izuku was going to tell the full story, including what had happened in middle school. It was not an easy decision, and looking out over the two classes as they got situated, it was overwhelming. He was beyond grateful for Katsuki, who hadn't let go of his hand since they had left the classroom. Izuku took a shaky breath, looking out at all the expectant faces, and then he looked down at his lap and started talking. When I was 4, I was diagnosed quirkless. I don't know if any of you know any quirkless people, but they aren't usually treated very well, and I was no exception. Izuku spoke quickly, getting out as much information as he could in the shortest time possible, so that he could get through with it. Kachan did his best to defend me. We'd known each other since we were babies, and he wasn't going to let something as minor as a quirk come between us, but no one liked that. Memories flashed through his mind, but he ignored them, pushing past the tears in his eyes to keep talking, even as he struggled to get words past the lump in his throat. Life was really bad for us back then. We were both coming home in tears every day, and Kachan was constantly in trouble for getting in fights to protect me. One day, Kachan got mad. He called me names and pushed me over, and everyone else backed off. That day we learned that if Kachan was my top bully, then no one else would bother me. Izuku did his best to stop the tears from falling. He needed to get through this, but he wasn't successful. He took a moment to use his free hand to wipe his face, and he was trying to wipe away any of the tears that were still falling. We started forming a secret language not long after that. We used it to talk at school, and no one else would know that we were actually friends, so he could bully me enough to keep the other students off my back. He was at the top of the social pyramid, while I was at the very bottom. If we let anyone know that he didn't hate me, he would find himself dragged into the bottom with me. Izuku felt Katsuki squeeze his hand, and he had to pause for a moment, overcome by gratitude for the explosive boy next to him. Izuku kept talking. He told them about what he had Katsuki do to him, what he had him say. He explained that Katsuki never meant any of it, but he had to do it to keep them safe. He paused when he got to the part about his quirk. This is going to be the hardest to explain, just because he can't be completely honest about it. I went into the entrance exam thinking that I was quirkless, but when I went up against the zero-pointer, the first aspect of my quirk made itself known. My strength was enhanced, and it shattered my bones. The theory is that it had made itself known earlier. My limbs would have all been blown off. It was only contained to shattering my bones because I had spent the 10 months previous working on strength training. Izuku looked up for a moment to gauge his classmates' reactions to him as he heard a few gasps. Many people looked shocked at what he was saying, but he didn't keep looking up long enough to see anything more than that. I made a mistake then. I didn't warn Kachan or explain what had happened. Izuku took a deep breath, and Katsuki squeezed his hand again. After seeing me use my quirk for the first time at UA, he assumed that I'd been hiding it from him that entire time. He was angry, all the way up until the moment right after our provisional license exam, when he finally allowed me to explain it all to him. At that point, however, all of your minds were made up. You knew our relationship to be more like what we had claimed it to be in middle school, something more similar to a bully and a victim, or rivals than actual friends like we are. It didn't help that we hadn't been allowed to act like friends in public since we were 4, so we'd forgotten how. Izuku took a deep breath, finally at the point where he needed to talk about what he had done during the exercise. Since the first secretive communication assignment, many of my friendships started to shift. I drifted away from people that I'd previously been really close to, while becoming closer to people that I'd barely known before. With that, I noticed that people's treatment of me had changed. Everyone knows that I used to break my bones on the regular, but barring last Friday night, when I held up a building, I don't do that much anymore. Yet, people I thought were my closest friends started to treat me like I did. People would step in to protect me during trainings, and step up to fight Kachan when he would insult me, even if by Kachan's standards he was being nice. It felt like the people that I had made friends with before this term had created a version of me that wasn't true, but that was all that they saw me as. People who saw me go full 100% and come out on top were treating me with kitty gloves, and I couldn't handle it. A little bit of anger made its way into his voice, so Izuku took another deep breath before taking another glance up at the class. He specifically looked for the people he was talking about, namely Uraraka. When he found her, he was surprised to find guilt on her face. I went into this exercise with the sole intention of destroying that version of me that people had created, the one where I was fragile and incapable. I didn't mean to go quite as plus ultra as I did, though, so I sincerely apologize to anyone whose grade was affected. Izuku took another deep breath before continuing on his next part. He had been debating adding it in and all, but he felt like it was important for people to know because it did have an impact on their grades. This past week, during my work study, I found out that I also had an advantage during these assignments. Besides having created a secret language with Kachan, I actually did have a part of my quirk active when I was younger. I have not figured out exactly how it works, but it increases other people's understanding of what I'm trying to communicate. With my quirk erased, Kachan can only understand the general idea of what I'm trying to say using our language, but with my quirk active, he can understand me just as well as if I was speaking out loud. With my quirk, I found that I can use the secret language that I created with Kachan to communicate with others. They only understand the general idea of what I'm saying, but the better they know me, the more they understand. Izuku gripped Katsuki's hand tighter. I'm explaining this to all of you because it played an important part in why the grades ended up the way they did. I went into this assignment with the intention of only working with Kachan, but after that staged fight we had during the prep time, a few people had figured it out and insisted on joining with us. With the extra help, I was able to really go plus ultra, which unfortunately is the reason that many other people's scores they'd dropped. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for so many people to be affected by my actions. Izuku hung his head, finally done talking. To his surprise, the person that had said something first was Kaibara from Class B. Don't apologize for taking the exercise seriously. We all could have done that, but we played it safe. We took the instructions at face value instead of actually trying to go all out. I got a 23 on this assignment, and yeah, I could have done better if someone hadn't gotten my object before I did, but the rest of my score was my fault. Thanks for explaining everything, though. The way that assignment ended was majorly confusing. Yeah, I mean, none of us know you that well, not for your lack of trying. Shota looked guilty as he spoke. But I think that we should probably be apologizing to you as well. You've tried to befriend all of us many times, but we always let Monoma scare you away. We were all surprised and blindsided during the assignment, but that was really our own fault. Izuku was shocked to see the numerous people that had agreed with Kaibara and Shota, most of them from Class B. From what he could gather, it seemed like Class B had been the ones worst affected by him. The objects he found were mostly the objects they needed, both for their tasks and objects. However, they all seemed to understand what he had done. Slowly, people started to leave the room, satisfied with this explanation. Before the majority of the people left, though, Tokage's voice had rang out again. After hearing that whole explanation, I have to know, what was your score? All we were told, really, was that it was more than double the previous record. Izuku froze at the front of the room, as many people that were leaving had stopped to turn to him, waiting for his answer. Katsuki squeezed his hand again, and Izuku took a breath. 339. Many students' jaws dropped, and Izuku did his best not to shrink in on himself. He was proud of his score, but after hearing that Kaibara had gotten a 23, he was also a bit embarrassed that he'd done so well. After many people voiced their surprise, they started leaving again, going about their afternoon. Izuku leaned into Katsuki, only to sit up when he was approached by Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, and Sue. He didn't notice, but Shinso, Kaminari, and Kirishima also joined them, standing off to the side behind Katsuki. They were all silent for a moment. Izuku had already said his piece, so he was waiting for anyone else to say something. Finally, Todoroki spoke first. I'm sorry. Izuku looked at him in surprise, but Todoroki kept talking. You've fought so hard to save me from myself, but somewhere along the way I forgot about that. I'm new to having friends, but even I know that the way that we were treating you was not acceptable. Before Izuku could think of a response to that, Ida was talking. I'm sorry as well. You saved my life in Hosu, but I allowed myself to be convinced that you needed us to step in for you. Izuku was going to question what he meant by saying he let himself be convinced, but Uraraka pushed her way to the front of the group to stand directly in front of Izuku. Stop! Uraraka had tears streaming down her face. Izuku could feel Katsuki tense next to him, and he finally noticed Shinso, Kaminari, and Kirishima were all there as they were ready to get between him and Uraraka if it came to it. No one knew what Uraraka was going to say or why she was crying, but she didn't leave them guessing for long. It was my fault. This is all my fault. I was such a terrible friend. I don't know, I got possessive. I mean, I know you were never mine, but I thought that we had something, that we were more than just best friends, and instead of talking to you about it, I just got clingy and protective, and I'm really sorry, Deku. You deserve better than that. I don't even know how to describe what was going through my head, but I'm so sorry. I should have never treated you any differently, and I definitely should have never convinced anyone that you needed protecting. Izuku could feel his eyes widening and his jaw dropping the more Uraraka spoke. When he had made the decision to apologize to his friends, he was expecting them to be hesitant to forgive him, not for them to apologize. I want to apologize too, Ribbit. I had made a big deal about all of us needing to act like heroes in the past, but there was nothing heroic about how we were acting. We convinced ourselves that we were protecting you, but we weren't. Sue spoke up when no one else did. Izuku took a deep breath before responding. I really appreciate your apologies. Honestly, I was expecting to still be begging for your forgiveness." Izuku laughed a bit, trying to get rid of some of the tension. "Well, if you think about it, Ribbit," Sue put her finger on her chin, "we should have expected this from you." Izuku looked at her in confusion. "It's been obvious since the very first day that you take Plus Ultra very serious. If we had thought about it at all, we would have realized that you weren't acting like you usually would during an exercise like that." Izuku smiled, happy that at least one of them was able to realize that, even if it was a little late. Uraraka laughed, even as her tears were still running down her face. "Yeah, looking back on it, I think the first moment that you really acted like you I saw during that exercise was when you stabbed me in the stomach. Before that, you just, I don't know, you weren't as Plus Ultra as you usually are, you know?" Ida and Todoroki were also smiling as they agreed. "Yeah, dude, you going Plus Ultra on an assignment is pretty normal for you," Kirishima even agreed. "You hear that, Deku? You're the embodiment of the school motto." Katsuki laughed along with them. After a moment, the laughter died out, and Uraraka looked unsure of something. "Deku, I know we really messed up, and I understand if you want some space from us, but do you think that we could be friends again? Real friends, not like we have since these assignments had started?" Izuku looked at each of his friends, since they all awaited his answer with wide eyes. He sighed. "I don't know. I hope so, but a lot has happened since then." He smiled at them, hopeful that this would work out. After a moment of silence before anyone could walk away, Shinso cleared his throat and started speaking while looking down at his hands. "I should apologize, too. I didn't go as far as Midoriya did, but I appreciate the apology, Ribbit, but you were just going along with this plan, right? I think that any of us would have done the same if given the opportunity." It was obvious that he was mostly apologizing to Sue and Ida. After all, they were the people that he personally removed, but she didn't even let him finish. "I agree. I was rather surprised to find out that you had poisoned me, and I would like to hear more about how you did that, but I can't say that if I was given the opportunity to work with Midoriya that I would have turned it down, even if it meant going against my friends." Ida realized what he said and promptly apologized to his friends, but he didn't take it back. "How did you poison him?" Todoroki asked Shinso. Shinso started to explain, but another voice cut him off. "Bakugo, Midoriya, Nezu needs to see you in his office." Aizawa called to them from just inside the door. Izuku and Katsuki made eye contact, but didn't argue. As they followed Aizawa out of the room, Izuku could hear Shinso continuing his explanation. He was glad that his friends all seemed to be getting along again, but he was more focused on what Nezu could possibly want to talk to them about. It didn't take long for them to reach the principal's office, and luckily for them, Nezu didn't waste any time before getting straight to the point. As soon as Izuku and Katsuki had sat down in chairs across from his desk, and Aizawa took his spot leaning against the wall, Nezu started talking. "I will make this meeting quick so that you can go back to whatever it was you were doing, but I figured that you'd want to hear this now before it hits the news tomorrow." Izuku and Katsuki glanced at each other in confusion. "I'm not sure if you were aware, but Mr. Aizawa and I have been investigating your middle school. The way that they treated both of you was completely unacceptable. They've been fighting every step of the way, but this afternoon the paperwork finally went through. Tomorrow morning the school will temporarily be shut down, and all the administrators and the majority of the teachers will be arrested. We have more than enough evidence, so we believe that all the charges will stick. There will be an investigation into the school district to decide whether or not the school needs to be reopened. If it does reopen, you can rest assured that it'll be held to a much higher standard than when you two were there." "About damn time someone did something about that hellhole." Katsuki grinned, and he grabbed Izuku's hand, squeezing it in excitement. "They're really going to jail?" Disbelief was all over Izuku's face. He never would have expected anyone to have consequences for what had happened at Aldera. "Yeah, kid. They're going to jail." Aizawa hid his proud smile on his scarf as he answered. "Thank you." Izuku had tears streaming down his face. "It was our pleasure." Nezu grinned as his eyes sharpened. A shiver went down Izuku's spine, and he knew just from Nezu's face that it really was his pleasure to take down Aldera. From what little he could see of Aizawa's face as well, it looked like that was his reaction, too. Before the silence went on for too long, Nezu spoke again. "That was the main thing I wanted to discuss with you, but since you're here I also was hoping to talk to you about how you communicate. I heard from Mr. Aizawa that, Midoriya, you have a quirk that helps with it." "Yes, sir. We haven't tested it much, but it seems to help people understand me," Izuku answered. "And it helps you understand other people, correct?" Nezu asked, eyes gleaming. I don't know. We haven't tested that." Izuku was curious, but they hadn't really tested it much. "But your communication with Bakugo goes both ways, correct? If he understands you less with your quirk cancelled, wouldn't it only make sense that it goes the other way as well?" Nezu seemed to already know the answer, but Izuku's mind was blown. "I recommend testing it at some point." Nezu clapped his hands. Well, that was all I wanted to talk to you about, but Midoriya, I think that All Might was hoping to talk to you for a bit in his room. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon." Izuku and Katsuki left the principal's office, holding hands. They walked to the room where Izuku would usually meet All Might, then stopped outside the door. Izuku was conflicted. He knew that All Might would want to talk to him alone, but he didn't want to let go of Katsuki's hand. Katsuki pulled his hand away when he realized that Izuku wasn't going to. "Go meet with him, Deku. I'll be right here waiting for you." Katsuki sat down against the wall and got comfortable. Izuku smiled, his eyes glistening with joy that Katsuki was willing to wait for him. After a moment he pushed open the door and walked into the room, taking the seat across from All Might. He knew that All Might was proud of everything that Izuku had done the past few weeks, but because the hospital wasn't the most secure place for discussing secrets, All Might hadn't been able to say much more than that, and they hadn't had a chance to talk since. It was silent for a while, but All Might finally spoke. "I've already told you this, but I'm really proud of everything that you've accomplished with this secretive language assignment. Every time I thought that I finally had an idea of what you could accomplish, you would exceed all my expectations and do something beyond what I even would have thought possible. I'm so proud of you, my boy." "Really? You're not mad at all? I lied a lot during that last assignment, and I was the reason that a lot of people failed it." Izuku shrunk into himself slightly. "The only thing that you were responsible for was your own score. You may have lied, but everyone else had the opportunity to do better if they had taken the exercise as seriously as you did." All Might smiled kindly at him. "Honestly, I was a bit taken aback by how you were acting at first, hearing your fight with Bakugo and then your explanation followed by the lying. I didn't know what to think." All Might shook his head. "I always imagined that you would follow in my footsteps and become a limelight hero, but what you did was like undercover heroics, and then you spent that week with Eraser." "I still want to be a limelight hero," Izuku chimed in before All Might could finish what he was saying. "My boy, you've proven yourself over the last few weeks that no matter what line of heroics you go into, I'm sure that you will save many lives. I'd be honored if you were to follow in my footsteps, but no matter what path you take, you're still my successor." All Might smiled at him, and Izuku felt tears leak from his eyes. "Thank you, All Might. But while I think I can do a lot of good underground or undercover, I think I'd be able to help the most in limelight. I've always wanted to save people with a smile just like you do. I want to make people feel safe just because I'm there, and the best way for me to be able to do that is by letting people know who I am." Izuku tried to explain his reasoning, that his mind was made up. "All I'm saying, my boy, is that you don't need to decide right now, and I'm proud of you and the hero you're becoming, no matter what you end up doing." All Might had a gentle smile on his face. Izuku was hit with the abrupt thought that this was what having a present father must be like, but he pushed that thought aside as soon as it appeared. They talked a little bit longer about his new quirk and how they could test it, and then Izuku left. As soon as he walked out of the room, Katsuki was standing, reaching out to grab his hand again. It was a little unexpected that Katsuki wanted to hold hands so much, but Izuku didn't mind one bit. They walked silently through the grounds. Normally at some point one of them would start up a conversation, but Izuku was deep in thought. After 10 minutes of just wandering, Katsuki seemed to get tired of the silence. "What's on your mind, nerd? You're usually not this quiet." "Oh, I'm just thinking," Izuku shrugged. "About what?" Katsuki pulled Izuku to the ground so that they were sitting with their backs leaning against a tree. "Just about these assignments and everything, I guess." Izuku started fidgeting with Katsuki's hand. "It's just, when the first assignment was announced, we were just barely back to being friends with each other. So much has changed since then. We're dating. I'm closer to Shinso and not as close to the rest of my friends, and I have more quirks now, including one that I apparently had for years. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't change any of it for the world, but it's kind of weird to think about when everything had happened because of these assignments. It makes me wonder how different our world and lives would have been if they'd never been assigned at all." "I think we still would have ended up here. It just might have taken a bit longer." Katsuki leaned over to kiss Izuku's cheek. "Really?" Izuku looked at Katsuki with wide, hopeful eyes. "Well, yeah. Those damn assignments didn't make me fall in love with you. The feelings were already there. They just pushed us to do something about them sooner." "You love me?" Izuku turned to face Katsuki, grabbing both of the explosive boy's hands. Katsuki's face turned pink, not realizing what he had said. He smiled and pulled one of his hands out of Izuku's grasp. Carefully he reached up and cupped Izuku's face, whispering to him as he got close. "How could I not?" Their lips were inches from each other, and Izuku stared into Katsuki's eyes. "I love you too, Kachan." As soon as he finished uttering the words, Katsuki's lips were on his. They hadn't kissed since the end of that exercise, but they both knew that this was the second kiss of many. All their hidden messages had brought them together, and they weren't going to let anything pull them apart. All right, everyone. This concludes the fic entitled Hidden Messages. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I think it was a really great one. I like these types of fics where Izuku and Katsuki had been friends the entire time. Let me know your thoughts and reactions below, and as always, thank you so much for listening.